Hi, everybody. Welcome to another edition of Surrey Schools Mental Health and Wellness. I am Daniel Toe. I'm a district principal here in the Surrey Schools District, and we are broadcasting on the traditional unceded territories of the Kwantlen, Semiahmoo, Katzie, and Coast Salish First Nations. So we just want to welcome all of you to this broadcast. We broadcast monthly on the Surrey School District YouTube mental health channel, as well as the Stigma-Free Society, our partner. We are so glad to be partnered with them on their Facebook page, as well as, I believe, their YouTube channel. I think, I see that I am broadcasting on their YouTube channel as well. So welcome all of you. And today we're so happy to have Sun Hoffman. She's actually someone I met not from the school district, but from the work I do with Trinity Western University, which is a private university here in British Columbia. And I interviewed her for one of my classes on leadership about ethnicity and her immigrant story. And I thought, wow, what a great story. I must have that story here, because as we talk about mental health, and whether you're watching this now live or you're watching it later on in a recording, I think her story will really speak to you when you look at the immigrant story, when you look at when new immigrants come, what they face on a daily basis. And even in the Surrey School District, for those of you who are teachers and parents watching, I think we had 2,500 new students this year, and more than half of them were new immigrants. So this is definitely a story of our existing population in our schools. And Sue's story, while it happened not this year, right, but happened when she came to Canada from South Korea. Am I right? Oh, yeah, right. South Korea, right? Her story is still so relevant today. So I'll let you start, Sue. Please introduce yourself, what you do, where you are, because you're definitely you're not in BC. I think I wrote on the YouTube channel you're in Winnipeg. Oh,
I'm
yeah.
in
Okay, so
Winnipeg.
Winnipeg.
Yeah.
And why don't you go ahead and just introduce yourself, and then we'll get on to the questions. And like I typically do, sometimes we flow organically away from the questions.
Sounds good.
All right.
Well, thank you, Daniel. And I just want to thank you for inviting me to this channel and to share my story. My name is Sun Hoffman, but I was born with the name Kyung Sun Park, and I'm from South Korea, as you've said. I immigrated here. I'm going to age myself in 1976. And so my story is pretty old, but perhaps timeless. And so I'm really happy to share my immigrant story with you all and just share some of the journey and the lessons that I've learned.
Awesome. Thank you. So, let's start with your immigrant story, how you came to Canada, why you came to Canada, and basically the story of your childhood growing up in school. As I said to you, I found you super relatable when we talked in that graduate program at Trinity Western. So, and I think your story is really indicative of how many immigrants come. My parents came and faced similar things, although I was born here. But why don't you tell your story, and I'll make sure I mute myself so I don't randomly talk.
No,
Yes.
I love your interjections. So I was born in South Korea in Seoul, and I was the second oldest. My older sister is 5 years older than me. And we went to a private school, like a pretty elite private school in Korea. And I just remember I was maybe 6.5, maybe I just turned 7. And I remember one day my mom said to me, you don't have to go to school this week because we're moving. I'm like, okay. And so I didn't know at that time that we were moving to Canada, but I remember being in the airport and everyone, and at the time in Korea too, just remember this was over 50 years ago. And Korea is a very monocultural society. Everyone is Korean, everyone. And also intergenerational. So I lived with my grandmother, we had our cousins, and we visited aunts. I just have really wonderful memories of living in Korea. And so I remember being in the airport and everyone was crying. I had no idea. I was only 7. And I was just, I thought, oh, we're going on a happy trip. And little did I know that I would never see my grandmother alive again. And I came to Canada, and my dad was sponsored by this, I guess, someone to come and work for them. And so we immigrated to this little town of Welland, Ontario. where everyone was
Wow.
either Italian or Dutch.
Wow.
You know, Italian and Dutch, they're all blonde hair, blue-eyed
Yes.
people.
Yes.
And so
Yes.
immediately, of course, I felt out of place. And I just remember, oh, it's interesting, you know, this memory came back. When we first came to Canada, we stayed in a church basement
Wow.
for about a week. And I remember feeling so, maybe shame is the right word. You know, we lived really well in Korea, and then now we're
Yeah.
living in a basement of a church, getting hand-me-down clothes from people and things like that. And then when we entered school, I was supposed to be in grade 2, but because I didn't speak a word of English, they put me
Right.
back into grade 1.
Wow.
And I know you can't tell because I'm sitting down, but
Yep.
I'm also freakishly tall for not only Korean, but for a female.
Okay. Okay.
I'm 5'10".
Wow. You're
And
taller than
so,
me for sure. If we were
am
standing
I?
beside each other, you'd be like up here. Yeah.
There you go. So, and I was always tall, and I had the small eyes, and my sister was she was shorter than me. She's 5'3" now, but she was the typical, you know, she had the big eyes. She was very pretty. She's 5 years older than me. And so I remember being in school. So I was put back into grade 1, and I didn't understand anything, but I do remember the kindness of the teachers that I had. They were very kind. I could just tell from, you know, their body language and their tone, their acceptance of me. But honestly, because my sister's 5 years older, she went into middle school right away. And so it was me and this East Indian kid. We were the only
Wow.
Asians in a school of all white people. I came from Korea, which I looked like everyone else. And
Yeah.
so I just remember feeling really out of place, even as a child, and angry too. I remember feeling like confused, like why did we move from Korea where things were so good? Like why did we come to Canada? I really didn't know. And I think being an immigrant child too, you don't have a choice. You know,
No.
your
Yeah.
parents don't say to you, hey, do you want to go to another country where we're not going to have any relatives and we won't know anyone, and, you know, you'll look different, but hopefully you'll have a better life. And so, you know, as a child, you don't have a choice. And it was difficult. It was difficult, even as a child. I remember that. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think your story, even though when kids come to say Surrey nowadays, they might see people who, because we're a lot more multicultural than Wellington, Ontario in the 70s, right? Like, you know, now in
Yeah.
the 2024. However, I still think, you know, leaving a better life, that's a story that a lot of people can tell. Leaving a life where it's really monocultural as opposed to multicultural, that's a story that everyone can relate to. And even when immigrants come and they are going to a school where they might see people who look like them, it's still even now not people who act like them, you know. And so I think that loneliness you talk about. Do you actually? I never asked you this before. Why did your parents come here? If everything was so awesome in Korea, like, are you even allowed to
Oh,
say it? It's some sort of like state secret. If you're not, that's okay. It's okay. I never asked you,
well,
and it's not even in one of the questions. So
you know, well, we might have to have a part 2 on
okay,
mental illness. I
okay,
found out much later. And I think I'm going to share this because I think a
okay.
lot of immigrant families probably could relate to this. I
Mm,
found out in my 30s that um, the reason they left Korea um, was because my mother remarried.
okay,
And in Korea at that time, so this was her second marriage.
okay.
And in Korea at that time, there's a lot of shame
Yep.
involved. So now, like these days, who cares, right?
I
But
don't
back
know.
then,
I think outwardly maybe, but still there's so, like when parents
maybe in
break
the
up,
old
it
country,
traumatizes kids still. Even when people, yeah,
yeah.
yeah.
And as a, you know, as a 6-year-old, I had no idea. Like it's
Hmm.
interesting how their brain works, you know. And so I found out in my 30s that that was the reason why they left a good life in Korea to come to
Mm,
Canada, because no one knew us here, and they could keep their secret and I guess their shame. And
yeah,
so it's interesting, isn't it? Yeah.
yeah. I
And I
know.
think that and actually that's a great question, because I think that the idea of generational shame
Mm-hmm.
and stress and
Yeah,
mental, it really does go down in the generations. And so even
absolutely.
though I, as a child, didn't understand why they came, I felt that shame.
Yeah,
And I didn't know why. But just to go back to your original question about my
yeah,
schooling and stuff, because
yeah,
they put
absolutely.
me back a year in grade
Yeah,
one, I just remembered I did pick up the English. You know, when you're 6 or 7 years old, your brain is so plastic. I picked up
yeah,
English really quickly. And because I didn't want to be, I felt so different. I looked different. I was the only Asian. I spoke differently. I was taller. I had taller than everybody else. So like, imagine being Asian and tall. Like it's just like, I,
I
and
can't. I'm not that tall. Yeah.
and I was bullied.
Mm,
I was bullied, but I also probably gave it back just as much. But so I took on an identity of being the smart kid, which
yeah,
is also a stereotype of Asians, right?
absolutely.
So I couldn't be the pretty girl. I couldn't be the. So guess what? I became the smart girl. I
Yeah,
became the
awesome.
stereotypically Asian
Yeah,
smart kid,
yeah,
and that's where I got my accomplishments from. I wanted to. That's where I got my self-worth. I
yeah.
felt if I did well in school, then I had worth and identity. And you know, as a child, I didn't know that, but that was just how it evolved. And I think a lot of immigrant kids, and my parents, I think they did actually explicitly say, but it's also implicit too. We expect you to do well, and we expect you to do better than us.
Hmm.
So
Is
there's
that
a lot
because
of pressure on immigrant kids.
well, because when they came here, they struggled as well, right? I remember
Oh,
when you told your story at Trinity, you said that they struggled to even make ends meet here.
they did, and they didn't have the English, they didn't have
Hmm.
the language, they didn't have, you know, the connections. And so again, it's almost kind of laughable, but we
Yeah.
did the typical okay, when you think of Koreans, what do Korean immigrants do?
Open a grocery store.
Yes, that's what we
I only
did.
think of the CBC shows, Kim's Convenience. That's the only thing I can think about, right? Yeah.
Do you know what, Daniel? I could not watch that show for years because
What?
it just brought back trauma. Like it just re-triggered me.
Okay.
We
Yeah.
I also lived above a grocery store, just like
What?
Kim's Convenience.
I didn't
Yes,
actually know that. Yeah. Oh, wow. Okay. I didn't know.
it was called Parks Variety, and
Wow. Cool.
I did free slave labor. My parents never paid us. There was
Yeah.
actually 5 of us, and we never got paid. We were expected to work. And we did. And yeah, I couldn't watch that show, but that show resonated with me and my life, and many of my Korean um, friends that grew up
Hmm.
in that era. So yeah, my parents worked 14, 16-hour days, and I saw
Wow.
how hard they worked. Before we got our own variety store, they worked at different places. They worked in a gas station. Like
Hmm.
they did all these jobs that probably I would think that in Korea they would have thought it was beneath them,
Hmm.
you know? And so, but how it impacted me was because they were away working, I actually took care of my little siblings
Okay.
quite a bit, even when I was 10, 11 years old. And have you heard of the term latchkey kids?
Yep.
Yeah, so I was one of those latchkey kids where we would walk to school. I walked probably like a mile or two there and back by myself, sometimes with my little siblings, and I would take care of them until my parents came home. And
Wow.
yeah, and so it honestly, I don't want to make myself sound like a sad little girl, but I really didn't have a childhood in a way, you
Yeah.
know. I think a lot of, I don't want to generalize, but I think a lot of immigrant kids
Yep.
probably could relate to that.
Yep.
Um, you know, I did a lot of things that other kids, I remember my friend who is not Asian, they would talk about going to Disneyland. They would talk
Mm.
about, you know, going to their grandparents' house for sleepovers. I didn't have any of that. And,
Mm.
you know, that's just the way it was. But yeah, it was hard.
And I think that whether it's the 70s or now, I think immigrant families can relate to that. A lot of them come like, even in the master's programs I teach, a lot of people come with high level degrees from their home country and come here and have to work in
Yeah.
lower end jobs. So we have my wife's a X-ray technician in Royal Columbian, which is a good job here. But there's
Mhm.
actually radiologists, so the doctors who come from other countries have to work as porters, like the people who push the
Mm,
tables, because they don't even qualify to be in my wife's job
yeah.
in a hospital here. And
Yeah.
they were a radiologist, one of the higher paid doctors back in their homeland. So that story that you and your family had is I think something that people face even today. When you were in school, I think you had mentioned in previous conversations that you even face some negativity from teachers. Like, we know that sometimes kids can bully, and you said you were tall, so you probably faced that off pretty decently, right? But
I
how
can
about
tell
from
stories.
teachers, right? How about from
What's that?
teachers? How about from teachers and other, like, did you get any, like, could they have treated you better in order to make your experience here better?
You know, I would say that for the most part, most of the teachers were fantastic.
Awesome. I love
I
hearing that.
remember, yeah, it was, I just remember my parents didn't have time to nurture
Hmm.
us. They were, and as an adult looking back, I totally understand. But as a child, you don't know. And
Yeah.
I found that a lot of the teachers were very nurturing and very caring. I think also it's the culture, right? Like the Asian culture, we don't show love.
No.
We show love by saying, why couldn't you do better? But
Yeah. Yeah.
but I do remember in growing up in public school, many of the teachers showed kindness to me. They showed caring and stuff. But I do remember this one lady. I was in grade 4. I had skipped grade 3 because I wanted
Mhm.
to catch up to my grade, and
Awesome.
so her name was Mrs. Clapp. I still remember her. I don't know why, but
Okay.
and I just remember I'm the good the good kid that's wants to do well, and I did do well. And I remember going to we were on a field trip to an art gallery, and we had to draw this picture. And I am a very good artist. I'll say that. So
Okay.
I drew this. I sketched this artwork, and I think when I look back to my little self, my little grade 4 self, I know I was looking for affirmation. I never got it at home.
Mm.
And so I went up to her and I said to her, this isn't very good. What do you think? And she looked at me and she said, you are the most self-centered, um, selfish girl. And she just walked away.
What?
And
What?
yes. And I was so shocked. And I'm not sure where she was coming from. And I don't know if she thought I was trying to be manipulative and get a compliment out of her, which I
Mhm.
think in retrospect, I probably was. Um, but it was very damaging to my soul
Yeah.
that she would respond to me like that. And I just remember too that, oh, this is interesting, all these memories coming up. Back then, way back then,
Yeah.
we had this um, uh, phys ed program where every morning we would do this morning routine where
Yeah.
we would do exercises to um, 1970 songs like
Yep.
raindrops keep falling on my head. Did you do
Yeah.
that? I think it
Yeah.
was a community
Yeah.
thing. And so they were going to videotape record us. And so I remember like we were waiting. I remember it was the same teacher, Mrs. Clapp. She was waiting for everyone to be in class so that she can take the video and whatever. And there was always somebody missing, sick. And I never missed school, but I got the mumps one week. And guess
Huh?
what? Guess when she taped the video? When I was away with mumps. And I just
Huh.
remember feeling so left out.
Yeah.
I already felt left out. I already felt like I didn't belong because I didn't look like anyone. My name is different. Like I like my name now, but you know what? Growing up with the name Sun, it was
Yeah.
horrible. It was
Yeah.
horrible. I hated it. And so, just like that. But in terms of how the teachers treated me, honestly, I've had a really good experience. And
Amazing.
it was. And I remember, can I tell one more story?
Yeah, of
Um,
course.
in high school, it was in Ontario. And back then we had grade 13, which they don't have it anymore. But I was taking grade 13 English. And I always got A's, but for this one essay, I got an A minus. And I remember his name was Mr. Solfi. He was Italian, and um, he said he had told the class that if we rewrite the essay for a better grade, we could do that. So I rewrote the essay because I wanted an A plus. And so I took the rewrite to his office, and I remember he's sitting back like this. And then he looked at my essay. He didn't even read it. He goes, "Son, sit down and close the door." So I closed the door, sat down, and he asked me, "Why did you rewrite this? You already got a good grade." And I said, I want to get into a good university. And I was telling him, and just remember, my parents never sat us down and ever talked to us really about things. They were tired. They worked 14, 16-hour days. And I just remember him spending almost an hour with me,
Wow.
telling me how, like, just speaking life into me.
Mm.
And I think it was the first time I actually experienced that. And because as an immigrant kid, like I think I was 17 or 18 at the time, what did my parents expect of me? They wanted me to be good. They wanted me
Yeah.
to do well in school. They
Yeah.
wanted me to be quiet, and they wanted me to work for free at a variety store. And so it was really the first time that an adult showed care, and I felt seen, and I felt
Mm.
heard. And I remember crying all the way to the bus stop. And at the time I didn't understand, but I realize now that it was that care of the teacher. He saw me as a
Mm.
person and not as an immigrant, or I'll never forget that. And I wrote him a thank you card a few years later. And
Amazing.
yeah.
Well, that shows the high level of care I always talk about teachers having. In I love our district because a lot of our teachers, all the teachers I work with, have that high level of care and care about those who they see as vulnerable and those who need it. We often forget that kids need that praise, right? We only want to call home if there's trouble, but imagine the phone calls we make if kids are doing well and we call, and how good the kids feel and how good the parents feel. But
It's
today is Pink Shirt Day. I'm wearing my pink shirt. I know you have a pink mug there. But reflecting, right? Yeah, awesome. How do you think that racism and cultural misunderstanding, even some of the maybe bullying you faced, affected your mental health? Right, you touched on that a little bit just now. But when you were
Mhm.
younger, even going through elementary school, high school, being different, always struggling to fit in, how did that affect your mental health?
Oh my goodness, how did it not affect my mental health?
Yeah.
Oh, you know, I um I felt a lot of shame.
Mm,
I felt out of place. I felt like I didn't belong. And it's something that I've had to struggle with all of my life. I felt not good enough.
yeah.
Um, and you know, I I think that I know everyone is bullied for something. I know
Mm,
that. For me growing up, I was bullied for looking different. Kids are mean. Kids can be mean, and they
yeah.
would say things like, I mean, I don't have to go into it. Like they would slit their eyes and they would pretend they're talking, in a Chinese language, whatever. And it was terrible. And I remember I don't know if you know the Enneagram, but I'm an Enneagram 8. And
Okay.
so I fight back. And I remember my mom, telling my mom that I was getting teased by kids. And she said, well, you have to fight them. You
Hmm.
have to, punch and kick.
Yeah.
I know that's probably not good advice,
Okay.
but it was the best advice she gave me.
Okay.
And so I learned to fight back. Um, and, but it still hurt.
Yeah.
It still, you know, um, goes internal to your
Yeah.
soul and to your emotions and to your spirit. And so I experienced explicit racism that way,
Mm,
but I also experienced implicit racism as well, in that,
mm,
like all those formative years of being a teenager and stuff, I don't think any boys ever showed interest in me.
hmm.
And I know it's because, I'm the only Asian. I was probably maybe one of 3 or 4 Asians in high school.
Okay.
And so guess what? I was a band geek. I was in the math club. I was all those things, very stereotypical.
Yeah.
But when my other friends were going on dates or being asked to proms, that never happened to me.
Mm,
And I know it's because back then, it just I felt again rejected.
mm,
And that is something that has haunted me as well for many, many years. Like, I'm in my mid 50s now, and
mm,
I would say every decade has gotten better. Um, but it was something that I really had to struggle with. And so those explicit biases and or racism, but also those implicit ones were also um, damaging and
mm.
hurtful. Yeah.
Well, one of the things sometimes we see is that kids try to abandon even their own personalities, their own ethnicity, their own way of being in order to fit in
For
better.
sure.
Did you ever feel like you needed to do that? I mean, you seem to, and again, as a Chinese Asian, the band, the music, I played all those things. I played music, played violin. I was supposed to be good at math. I'm actually not, but I was supposed to be really good at math. And I know I was good up until middle of high school, and then I just sort of got lazy. But all those things, I get that as well. But did you ever try and fit in? Like for me,
Oh.
I tried to do more of the Canadian sports. Like I played hockey. I dabbled in rugby a bit. Even actually, my son right now plays rugby, but he chose it. I didn't make him. But I dabbled in things trying to fit in, and I grew up in the 80s and 90s, so just a little bit after
Mhm.
when a lot of the immigration started happening in BC. But even then, even though there were more folks that look like us, Chinese, right? Being a Chinese born Canadian, you really try to be more Canadian than Chinese, right?
Mhm.
All of us
Yeah.
Chinese born Canadians, we actually not look down on, but we're like, oh, we like a phrase that we often say, oh, we're not from Hong Kong, we're from here. We said that a lot because we didn't want to be stereotyped as the immigrants that were coming, and again, that we obviously should have never done that, but that's how we felt when we were growing up
Oh,
in
yeah.
Vancouver, right? And there was immigration happening already. How about yourself? Like, did you ever want to abandon your identity and be somebody else and do other things to fit in better?
Oh, definitely. I can totally relate to what you're saying. I begged my mom and dad if I could change my name to Karen or Tracy.
Oh,
I'm glad it's
oh,
not
I
Karen
think I
now.
called you Sue by mistake. I thought you were going to say Sue because at least you're just changing a letter. But son,
No.
yeah, the Tracy and
Um,
Karen are way off from son.
Isn't that funny? Yeah. Well, because in my generation, when I was in public school, Tracy was a very common name, and so was
Okay,
Karen, and it was
okay,
very popular. And so I
okay,
begged them, "Can I change my name?" But for some reason, they wouldn't let me, and I'm glad they didn't
yeah.
now. But yeah, I wanted to change my name. For me, it was really hard to fit in. I have a different story than you because I am an immigrant. It sounds
Hmm.
like you were born here.
Yes.
And so things were a little bit more difficult. I
Mm,
didn't have the after school activities that I could
hmm.
participate in. I had to work in the grocery store, or I
Yeah.
had to watch my, younger siblings and things like that. So it was a little bit harder to fit in. I do remember wanting and asking if I could bring ham sandwiches to school for lunch instead of
Yeah.
rice and kimchi
Yeah.
because I know it's popular now,
So
but
popular now.
back
I
then
think my kids had that today actually, and they're not even Korean. So, yeah, they had like those triangles, those rice triangles with the
yeah.
fluff pork inside. Yeah, they
Oh
literally
yeah.
took that to school
Yes.
today. Yeah.
Yeah, those are
Yeah.
good. Those are
Yeah.
good. And I remember in university too. It was, it's really strange because in university all of my friends were Chinese.
Oh,
It was I don't know why, but I really migrated towards the Chinese students.
okay.
I felt that I had more in common with them, and so all of my best friends were Chinese students in med school or in engineering. Very stereotypical.
Yeah.
And I actually really look down on the Korean university students.
Oh,
Like,
interesting.
I know, isn't it? And I really like. I remember going to one Korean cultural event and just thinking, oh, the boys were all slimy and the girls were like, I thought they were just snobby and
Huh.
I was probably the snobby one. I don't know, but I think that is part of what they call like being ashamed of your own culture. And
Mm,
so, you know, there was something about the Chinese culture that I really liked. I'm
okay.
not sure what it is. I think I just felt more accepted by them. Um, and so I abandoned my own Korean culture and I didn't want to date anybody that was Korean at all.
Okay.
And there is a article by actually I think his name was Daniel Hill, Dr. Daniel Hill. I can't actually I remember his name, but he called it white identity.
Okay.
And he stated that as immigrants, sometimes it's exactly what you talked about, how
Mm,
we abandon our own culture to try to become more white. And
huh.
when I read that, I really struggled. Is that what I did unconsciously? Did I have an unconscious bias against my own Korean culture
Huh.
and abandon it by marrying a white man? Like, as you can see, my last name is Hoffman. He
Yeah.
is 100% German blood. You can't get whiter than my husband. And I know I'm laughing about it now, but I really, when I read his article, I had to do some soul searching
Mm,
and um, and really wonder, like, did I look down on my own Korean culture? And you know, again, talking about mental health and stuff, my
mm,
parents, as I think immigrant parents, they do give up a lot.
mm.
Like you said, you know, some people give up their professions, like
Yeah.
they're doctors, and here they're pushing carts or porters,
Yeah.
and they have their own mental health issues. And
Yeah.
so I know my parents, they also gave up their professional designations, and there's, you know, working in gas stations, and they worked in variety stores, and it was not easy being a child of parents that have worked 14, 16-hour days. And there was a lot of stress in our home. There was a lot, I remember feeling like I was walking in eggshells. I didn't want to, you know, make my dad mad so that, you know, that he would get mad for some reason. There was a lot
Mm,
of that. And so I think part of the reason I didn't want to be that Korean, you know, culture or anything is,
yeah.
looking back, I think I didn't want that kind of family life for myself. And so that's all I knew. And I think you're right. I wanted to fit in more. And if I couldn't fit in, then maybe my kids could.
Yeah.
And the irony, though, is I have 3 adult children, and they all identify as Korean, not as German. Isn't that
Is that right?
interesting? Yeah.
Do they look? I've not met you in person. One day I will. But do they look more Asian than German, or do they look mixed?
My oldest looks more Canadian,
Hmm.
but my second and third look more Asian. I mean, they look mixed. They look like Korean movie stars, like, you know, those
Oh,
Korean movie stars.
yes, I
That's
do
really
know.
what they
Yes,
look like. Yeah,
yes. Y-
but they do look
So
more Asian than Caucasian.
So I think I told you when we started this and when we talked last time, 34 minutes goes by really fast, and I really only have 40. So we're already. So I do want to get the last question, but this again, maybe I'll have to have you on again with your whole family and talk about, like, surviving as a mixed family one day. But what advice and suggestions do you have? Because I think your story is still really relevant to immigrants coming now. They come here, they're looking for something. Rent proportionally is just as bad now as it was in the
Mhm.
70s for your parents living in the basement of church. We have that happening now with Sudanese refugees, with
Yeah.
right, with Iraqi refugees, with Ukrainian refugees coming, right? It's
Yeah.
not even just culturally, visually minorities. Ukrainians look very white, but they're also suffering from the same, some of the same things that any immigrant would come into Canada. And what advice do you have to give? Because I think that struggle is that tension between, I think when we were talking before we started, that wanting to fit in, and even as a school system, sometimes we want to normalize people to what we see, as
Hmm.
opposed to recognizing the difference that they bring to the table, right?
Yeah.
We want, I don't know how many times I've heard this term used even peripherally or directly, as, oh, we want you to be more Canadian. Not like,
Mm.
we're not like, it's not the melting pot that sometimes people stereotype America to be, but we want you to be more Canadian. Why don't you like hockey yet? Or why don't you, eat poutine? Like, do you know what I mean? Like, these things we say,
Hmm.
right?
Hmm.
Yet,
Yeah.
we not really recognizing the difference that some of these really unique and special cultures bring to the table when they come and live with us.
Yes.
So what
Yeah.
advice do you have to give to immigrants, to sort of break that tension? Obviously, I don't really know how to do it, and we're still figuring out as a school system and as people and as educators how to do that well, so everyone feels cared for in our system.
Mm.
What
Well,
advice would you give to
obviously,
us both,
dialogues like this.
immigrants and then to teachers? Yeah, to both.
Well, okay. The advice I would give to teachers, and
Mm,
perhaps it's already something you already know, is I want you to remember that immigrant parents have no idea what the system is like,
yeah.
and they don't have the language, they don't have the background culture, they can't help their children with the schoolwork or anything like
Mm,
that. And so I really had to kind of parent myself. Even I remember, even as a child in public school, my parents couldn't help me with my homework. They couldn't sign,
mm.
those forms to
Yep.
sign. They
Yep.
didn't they didn't know what they were signing. Like,
Yep.
they didn't like. So I think if I was to give advice to the teachers, I would just remember that they don't know the system,
Mm,
and if they're not returning things on time, it's probably because they don't know how to read it, or
mm,
they're not aware of it. Um, Maybe their children didn't even give it to them. Often things are sent via email these days. If you can't read English, Google
yeah.
Translate can only do so much. And
Yeah.
so it would be actually a great idea to have a forum where you could kind of give a overall, this is how the system works, and not just
Mm,
assume that parents know
yeah.
how it works. My parents certainly didn't, and
Mhm.
it was difficult. I think the advice I would give to immigrant students
Yeah.
um, would be to really embrace and understand your own culture. I
Yeah.
wanted to abandon it.
Mm.
And one of my biggest regrets is that I don't have my Korean language anymore. I still speak like a 5-year-old. And
And my Chinese is pretty much the same. Yeah,
yeah, but
10-year-old.
you were born here.
Yeah.
I don't have the same,
Yeah.
I don't have that excuse. I, my parents put us in Korean language school growing up and all that stuff. And I was told, remember, you're Korean, you're Korean, you're Korean. But I wanted to abandon it. And I didn't want to speak Korean, and I don't, and I didn't understand that a lot of the ways my parents were was actually not because of their personality. It's our Korean culture,
Mm,
and so there was a lot of shame. I know I keep bringing up the word shame, but there
mm,
was a lot of that, and it caused a lot of anxiety in me as well. And so the advice I would give to new immigrants is to embrace your culture,
mm.
to have a better understanding of your culture, and to be proud of your culture, to be proud of your identity. And if I can just share one
Of
story very
course, please
quickly.
do.
When I was 21, I went back to Korea on an
Oh,
exchange program. And I remember being so excited to go back because I thought, I'm finally going to fit in. I'm finally going to look like everyone else. And growing up, my dad always told us, remember, you're Korean, you're Korean, you're Korean. And I went back to Korea. I was so excited. And guess what? I didn't look like everybody else. I dressed differently. I walked differently. I was bigger than everyone
You're
else.
taller, right?
Koreans are tiny people.
Yeah.
And then they ended up calling me Miss Canada. And so
Huh.
I had such a major identity crisis when I was 21 because I thought, where do I belong? I don't
Wow.
belong in Canada. I don't belong in Korea. Where do I belong? So I think the other thing too for immigrant kids is they are growing up as third culture kids. They
Yeah.
don't have a culture anymore. They don't have a sense of identity. And identity is something that's so important to each one of us, right? A sense of I am who I am, and this is where I belong. And I didn't have that. And I remember having, and thankfully, there was an older, wiser woman. She was in her 60s, and I just poured out my heart to her. She was Canadian. She was there. And she gave me such good advice. And she said to me, you know what, son? You are very fortunate. She actually changed the way I thought. Like she changed my paradigm. She said, you're very fortunate because you're in a unique position where you understand both the West and the East. And she told me that I can be like a bridge for my generation. And in fact, something like this is actually something that she predicted that I would be doing something like, 30, 40 years ago. And I'm very grateful for this opportunity to share my
Mm.
story. And so she told me to embrace my third culture identity
Yeah.
and to also embrace my Koreanness. And um, it has been, I would say, almost my superpower,
Wow.
right? And so
Yeah.
if we can change the paradigm for these kids who are coming
Yeah.
and help them to embrace this unique position that they're in, I think that it could change the mental health of many new immigrant kids.
Yeah.
And, coming to a new country, leaving the family and the life that you have, a lot of them probably left a very good life to
Mm-hmm.
come here to struggle. It is traumatic. And so
Yeah.
if we can help them in their mental health in that way by helping them to embrace it and not be ashamed of it, I think that would do a world of good.
Well, no, and I love what you said. Like a lot, they don't not only not know the school system, they don't know the medical system. They don't
That's
know,
right.
just the government forms and how to get a driver's license. There's all these things that
Yeah.
they were fine in their home country, even a very developed home country, right? But
Mhm.
when they get here, everything's just different. I love what you said about embracing the third identity. My own kids. Um, my son actually probably grew up for 5 years not realizing he was Chinese because we only speak English. Actually, my parents taught my brother and I English first when we were
Oh,
born because they were
wow.
afraid that we wouldn't fit in.
Yep.
So we didn't really know Chinese till we started watching Chinese TV and started learning. So I'm really good at movie language, but in banking because I worked in a HSBC, but not regular. I can't converse properly with Chinese people. I can either use movie language or banking terms,
Uh-huh.
right? But my
Yeah.
parents taught me English first, but probably for the exact same reason you didn't speak Korean,
Yeah.
you know.
Interesting. Yeah.
And I think sometimes we just feel my regret is not speaking Chinese to my kids, whether it's Mandarin or
Mhm.
we speak primarily Cantonese, but Mandarin Cantonese because I want them to know their culture too. I think a lot of times when new immigrants or first gen kids abandon their culture, it leaks down, and I think it's important to keep those cultural roots, right? Because it's part of our identity, and I think that have you ever? This is maybe my last question, going way over time. But did you, after that, you went to Korea? Did you try and with your kids really try and embrace some of that identity back? I know you said your kids identify themselves as Korean. Did you try and embrace some of that, take some of that back, your cultural roots as well?
I think I have. I think I have. Part of the way I did that is through food. Uh,
Hmm.
I I make I make predominantly Korean food at home.
Oh, yummy.
Yeah, it's healthier.
Yeah.
uh, I have tried to better understand my parents, and I'm embarrassed to say this, but or maybe every teenager thinks this, but I was really embarrassed of my parents. They couldn't speak
Mm,
English. They smelled like garlic because
mm.
kimchi is predominantly
Yep.
garlic based. There was a lot of embarrassment. I didn't want to bring friends over. They couldn't speak English very well. But now I am calling them every day and I'm asking
Wow.
them questions about their own history. Like they have an incredible history. They went through the
Yeah.
Korean World War. They have
Wow.
all these, they have this richness that I didn't know because I didn't bother asking them while I was
Huh.
growing up. And so there's a lot of barriers, right? Not only cultural, generational, but also language barriers. And I remember my mom telling me that when she was growing up, she was 5 years old, and the Japanese had taken over the Korean. I didn't know any of
Hmm.
this, right?
Yeah.
And so they killed our royal king and queen, and they forced them to speak only Japanese, and they had
Mm.
changed their last names. And so she was saying, that's why we want you to retain the Korean language, because if you don't have the language, you lose the culture. And you know, I think that that's what's happening in the indigenous in
Yeah.
Canada as well, right? So we have a
Yeah.
lot of, actually in Manitoba, we have a couple of schools that's they're teaching Cree. It's like
Wow.
instead of French immersion, yeah, it's Cree
That's
immersion,
cool.
and it's amazing. It's
Yeah.
amazing, and I celebrate that, because if you lose your language, you lose your culture. And
Yeah.
so I'm trying to embrace that. And I'm actually learning Korean myself through Duolingo.
Nice.
It's never too late to
Okay.
learn.
Never
And
too late to
so,
learn.
yeah. So, yeah, thank you for that question. That's great. That's a
No
great question.
problem. And I unfortunately need to end this conversation, but thank you so much, Sun, for um, just sharing your story. I probably have to find a way to continue this dialogue. We actually, just so you know, this idea sparked an idea with the director of diversity and equity, as well as my director of instruction. We're gonna probably do interviewing teachers and those who are either born here or their immigrant stories, different educators, so the kids can see, hey, my teacher also has this story. My vice principal also has this story. My education assistant also has this story. So build a little bit more relationship between those who are new immigrants here, or maybe first gen, and the people they see every single day. Because sometimes students see their teachers and they go, oh, you must be super comfortable, super aware. Your life must have been perfect. That's what you're teaching. But not knowing that I went through those struggles as well, being someone of a different ethnicity in this place that we call Canada, where a lot of people see us as multicultural, but there are still some sort of elements of hidden, implicit possible racism and you know, not recognizing that diversity exists and needs to thrive. So I appreciate you. Thank you so much for coming on. Do you have any final parting words for the Surrey School District? You're far, but also close because we're on YouTube. Any parting words and final words about our topic: mental health, racism,
Well,
ethnicity, diversity?
I would just say I'm so grateful for all the teachers.
Mm.
I can't think of any other profession that has a higher calling. I honestly can't. Like I said, teachers have had such a positive impact on my life growing up as an immigrant kid in a very, I'll say it, it was a dysfunctional family growing up. And the teachers that spoke into my life, they were, I'm so grateful for them. And so I just want to thank you and all the teachers for the work that you're doing. It's not just a profession, it's a calling. And I just want to thank you.
All right. And on that note, we will end. Sun, please stay on because you don't disappear even when I end the stream. But thank you all for watching, whether you're watching here right now or you're watching later on when we record this, and whether it's on the Stigma-Free channel or on ours, the Surrey School District. We thank you for watching. Please join us again in April when we talk to one of our own students who is advocate for mental health. He's been on TEDx. He goes to one of our secondary schools, and we're going to talk to him about his mental health journey in April. Thank you so much. Have a great day, everybody.